My name is Iris Ashford. I'm 31 now. Software engineer, small company founder, the kind of person who shows up early and stays late. But when I was 9 years old, my parents drove me to a horse ranch in eastern Oregon and left me on the porch with a plastic suitcase. My grandfather, Henry Ashford, stood in the doorway and watched their car disappear down a gravel road. He didn't wave, neither did they. 10 years later, those same parents showed up at his funeral in pressed black suits, talking about family, talking about fairness, talking about $100 million they believed was rightfully theirs. But here's what none of them knew. Grandpa had already signed everything. And when the lawyer opened that document in front of a room full of witnesses, my mother's face went from entitled to ashen in about 4 seconds flat. I'll get there. But first, let me take you back to the day they left me behind. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where quiet people meet loud betrayals and walk out steadier than they came in. If family and money ever taught you a lesson you didn't ask for, this one's going to land. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. It was August. I remember that because the air smelled like dried grass and hot fence wire, and my sneakers stuck to the vinyl backseat of my father's Buick. We'd been driving for 6 hours from Portland, and nobody had said a word to me since the gas station in Bend. My mother, Diane, sat in the front seat scrolling through a magazine. My father, Glenn, drove with one hand on the wheel and the other tapping the armrest like he was counting down the minutes until he could be somewhere else. When we pulled onto the gravel road that led to Ashford's stables, my mother finally turned around. She didn't look at me. She looked past me, at the suitcase. "You'll have your own room," she said. "Grandpa's got a big house." That was the pitch. That was the entire explanation for leaving your 9-year-old daughter with a 70-year-old man she'd met twice at Christmas. Glenn carried my suitcase to the porch and set it down like he was dropping off a package. He didn't kneel. He didn't hug me. Diane stayed in the car with the engine running, window cracked 2 inches. I stood on the bottom step and looked back at her. She met my eyes for half a second, then looked at Glenn and said something I barely caught through the glass. I heard enough. She was the one we could afford to lose. The Buick backed out. Gravel popped under the tires, and the only sound left was the creak of the old windmill behind the barn, turning slow and steady in the August heat, like it had been turning long before I got there and would keep turning long after everyone forgot I existed. I stood on that porch for a while. Long enough for the dust to settle and the Buick to vanish past the tree line. Then the screen door opened behind me, and there was Henry Ashford, 6'1", white hair buzzed short, wearing a chambray work shirt with grease under his fingernails. He didn't crouch down to my level. Didn't ask if I was okay. He looked at my suitcase, then at me, and said, "Can you carry that yourself?" I nodded. "Good. Your room's at the top of the stairs, second door. Drop it off, then meet me in the workshop." No hug, no cookie, no pep talk about how everything was going to be all right. Just a direction and a job. I dragged the suitcase upstairs, shoved it in a room that smelled like cedar and old wool blankets, and walked back down. The workshop was behind the main barn, a long concrete-floored room lined with pegboard walls and hand-labeled tools. Wrenches hung by size, socket sets in order. Everything had a place and a reason. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Saddle leather and machine oil, layered deep into the wood and concrete like the building itself was made of work. Henry was standing at a bench, holding a bridle with a broken buckle. He pointed to a stool next to him. "Sit." I sat. "Watch." I watched. He didn't explain what had gone wrong with my parents. He didn't promise things would get better. He just fixed the buckle, slow and precise, and when he was done, he handed me a rag and said, "You'll work. Working is how you stop drowning." That was my welcome to Ashford Stables. Henry taught me how to use a torque wrench before he taught me how to make scrambled eggs. That first week, I learned to tighten a bolt to spec. Not too loose, not stripped. "Feel it catch," he said. "That's where the metal wants to stop. You go past that, you break what you're trying to hold together." He said things like that. Short sentences with a second meaning hiding behind the first one, and he never pointed out the second meaning. You either caught it or you didn't. By the second month, I was helping him repair fence posts and recalibrate the irrigation pump. By the third, he let me use the welding torch. Supervised, gloves, and mask on, but real work. He never talked about my parents. Not once. If I brought them up, he'd pause, then redirect. Hand me the 3/8 socket. Go check the water trough in paddock 2. It wasn't cruelty. It was a decision. He was teaching me that I could build a day without them in it. One evening, I was watching him sketch a modification for the barn ventilation system. Clean lines, precise dimensions, the kind of drawing that belonged in an office, not a ranch. And I noticed the ring on his right hand. Iron, not gold. Thick band, worn smooth on the outside, with something etched into the inner surface I couldn't read. "What's that ring?" I asked. He looked at it like he'd forgotten it was there. "My father's." "What's it for?" He turned it once around his finger, keeping a promise. Then he picked up his pencil and went back to drawing. "You don't inherit a thing, Iris. You earn the right to keep it." I didn't understand what he meant. I would. I didn't know what my grandfather was worth until years later. To me, he was a man who fixed things and went to bed by 9. But Henry Ashford had been a mechanical engineer for 32 years before he retired to the ranch. He held patents, 14 of them, on irrigation valve systems used by agricultural operations across the western United States. The royalties alone were substantial, but he never talked about money. He drove a 20-year-old Ford truck. He bought his clothes at the feed store in town. The ranch itself sat on 1,100 acres of high desert grazing land with water rights that dated back to the original homestead deed in 1923. Ashford stables ran 37 horses, mostly quarter horses, a few warm bloods, and the operation broke even on boarding fees and training sessions. But the land underneath it, combined with the patent portfolio, was worth a figure I wouldn't have believed if you'd told 9-year-old me. Henry never mentioned it. The only sign was the way people in town treated him, not with deference exactly, but with a kind of quiet respect that went beyond neighborliness. The hardware store owner called him Mr. Ashford. The county clerk returned his calls the same day. The vet drove out on weekends when a horse needed checking. I thought that was just how small towns worked. I didn't realize it was how small towns worked when one man had been quietly holding the economic floor for 2 decades. The man who ate canned soup for dinner 3 nights a week was sitting on $100 million in land and intellectual property, and the people who dumped me at his door had always known it. The years pass the way they pass on a working ranch. In seasons, not semesters. I learned to shoe a horse at 12, rebuilt the south fence line at 13. At 14, Henry and I took apart the windmill behind the barn, the same one whose creak had been the last sound I heard the day my parents left, and we rebuilt it from the base plate up. New bearings, new blades, rebalanced rotor. Henry showed me how to calculate wind load, how to account for metal fatigue in the shaft housing, how to test the pump action at different RPMs. It took us 3 weekends. When we finished and the blades caught the first gust, that creak was gone, replaced by a smooth, steady hum. I stood there listening to it and felt something I didn't have a word for. Henry did. That's the sound of something working the way it's supposed to. The workshop was where I spent my evenings. While other kids my age were on their phones, I was learning to read engineering schematics and solder circuit boards. The smell of that room, saddle leather and machine oil, became the smell of home. Not the house, the workshop. That's where Henry was most himself, and where I became most myself. He taught me drafting. He taught me to code on a secondhand laptop. He taught me that frustration is just a signal you haven't found the right angle yet. And he never once said, "I'm doing this because your parents left." He just showed up every day, same shirt, same ring, same steady hands, and worked beside me until the thing was fixed. No speeches about resilience, no inspirational quotes. Just work, done right, done together. My parents called maybe 4 times a year. Christmas sometimes. My birthday. if they remembered. The calls followed a pattern. Diana